Hey there, everybody. Jeff Dalick here with Our Curious World, bringing you another story of the mysterious, the unexplained, and the just plain weird. So I've always been fascinated by remarkable coincidences in history and thought it might be fun to examine some having to do with some of the men who have served as President of the United States over the last 250 years. While my foreign listeners may find this journey into America's political past of little interest, see if you don't find some of the coincidences and events I mentioned here curious nonetheless. So you ready? Let's get into it. There's just something about bizarre coincidences in history I find too good to pass up. And in a country that has 250 years of intrigue and just plain weird things happen to it, there's quite a few I find truly unique and worthy of mention. Naturally, those boring statisticians out there will simply dismiss these as evidence of random chance playing games with our brain, but I, for one, still find them intriguing. See if you don't agree. Before going any further, you should know I will not be presenting the most famous of all presidential coincidences, those between the Lincoln and the Kennedy assassinations. While the parallels between these two horrific events are considerable and more than just a little remarkable, they've been done to death, so I'm not going to go over them again. However, if you are interested in that particular chain of bizarre coincidences, I do mention them briefly in my video on the Challenger Columbia C7 curse. See the description below for a link to that video if you want to check that out. What I'm more captivated by are those unusual coincidences and bizarre facts that are less well known. So here are my choices, in no particular chronological order, of the most unusual coincidences, parallels, and curiosities from some of our past presidents. The first has to do with the Declaration of Independence, which was officially adopted on July 4th, 1776. The significance of the date, however, lies not in when the document was first adopted, but what happened on the 50th anniversary of its signing on July 4th, 1826. It seems that two of the most important figures behind the drafting and writing of the document, the country's second president, John Adams, and the country's third president, Thomas Jefferson, somehow managed to both die on that very same day. How they managed to accomplish this is a mystery, but the fact is that these two once close friends and allies and later bitter rivals both managed to buy the farm a few hours apart on the 50th anniversary of the adoption of the very document they were so closely associated with. Is nothing if not impressive. On a side note, you might find it interesting to know that Jefferson was John Adams' vice president before he ran against the man for president in 1800 and beat him, which made Adams not only the first sitting president to lose re-election, but the first and only president to lose to his own vice president, which I suspect may have been the source of some of their later acrimony. Of course, this would be almost impossible today, as the president and the vice president are always at the same political party, and so it'd be extremely unlikely that the president would ever be directly challenged by his own vice president, were he, or hopefully one day she, to run for a second term. The reason Jefferson was able to pull it off was because there weren't rival political parties back in the late 18th and 19th century like there are today, making it possible for pretty much anyone to run for president without the backing of any particular political party machine. It was largely a matter of popularity, with a little backing from affluent political allies, which is what made it possible for Jefferson to defeat his own president. In fact, he was so popular, or Adams was so unpopular, that Jefferson actually won with the today unheard of total of 61% of the popular vote. Okay, while sitting vice president being able to defeat his own president, and both men managing to die on the same day is impressive enough, how about two of our assassinated presidents, both managing to have vice presidents with the same last name? The country's 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, was succeeded by one Andrew Johnson, while the nation's 35th president, John F. Kennedy, was succeeded by Lyndon Johnson, which is quite a coincidence, don't you think? Further, and though the two men were not related to each other, it's curious that they were both Southern Democrats who were born exactly 100 years apart. Andrew Johnson in 1808 and Lyndon Johnson in 1908. The moral of the story? If you are ever elected President of the United States, try not to have a vice president named Johnson. Speaking of same last names, did you know that several presidents are actually related to each other? The first of these were the Adams, not to be confused with the Addams Family of the 1960s TV show. Was the aforementioned John Adams, the second president of the United States, being the father of the sixth president, John Quincy Adams. But they weren't the only father-son duo. The 41st president, George Herbert Walker Bush, was the father of the 43rd president, George W. Bush, suggesting that nepotism has always been a part of the political landscape. On a side note, it should be noted that both sons, John Quincy and George W., lost the popular vote, but still somehow managed to win the presidency. How is that possible, you ask? Because of something called the Electoral College. Trying to understand how the Electoral College works is both confusing and a little boring, so I won't go into it here. Suffice it to say that with this uniquely American process, the president is not selected by a majority or even a plurality of the popular vote, but by the number of electoral votes assigned to each state based upon the size of its population. As a result, a candidate could run up the popular vote totals in heavily populated states and still fall short of the currently required 270 electoral votes needed to be declared the winner. And while this rarely happens, it is not unheard of. In fact, this happened several times, especially in recent decades, with no fewer than 4 candidates managed to win the presidency without winning a majority of the popular vote. The first time this happened was in 1824, when the aforementioned John Quincy Adams was one of 4 candidates running for the presidency. Again, this was before the creation of the two-party system we have today. And he finished second to the more popular Andrew Jackson. That's the guy in the $20 bill, in case you were wondering. However, while Jackson won the popular vote and had more electoral votes than Adams, he didn't have the number required to be named president, which left it up to Congress to determine the winner. During this messy process, one of the other candidates voluntarily dropped out of consideration and threw his support to Adams rather than Jackson, which gave John Adams' baby boy the necessary electoral votes to be named president, much to Jackson's ire, despite having technically lost the election. Don't worry though, Jackson got his revenge when he ran against Adams again 4 years later and blew him out of the water. Same thing happened again in the election of 1876 when Democrat Samuel Tilden beat Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, but ended up being just 1 electoral vote short from claiming the presidency. However, in something of a harbinger of the future, the final vote tallies in 4 states were in dispute, creating a constitutional crisis that was finally settled when Republican leaders agreed to end Reconstruction in the South in exchange for the Democrats letting Hayes receive the disputed electoral votes, giving him just enough votes to win and throwing old Sam Tilden under the bus. After that, the country managed to go an entire 124 years avoiding such an outcome, but nothing lasts forever, it seems. In the election of 2000, between George H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush, and the then sitting Vice President Al Gore, Bush actually lost the popular vote by almost 500,000 votes, but still managed to acquire the 271 electoral votes needed to secure the presidency. Actually, it wasn't quite that easy. Like the 2 previous times that happened, there was controversy in regard to the final vote tally in the state of Florida, whose winner would receive the state's 25 electoral votes and with it the presidency. While Bush was originally declared the winner, a surge of late votes seemed to swing the state in Gore's favor. After a crazy evening of the 2 men trading the lead back and forth, Bush was finally declared the winner by a razor-thin margin, mandating that a recount take place. And while in the midst of this month-long recount, that the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in and abruptly stopped the process at a point at which Bush still held a slim lead, awarding him the state's electoral votes and with it the presidency. Unless anyone is naive enough to imagine this could possibly happen again, just 16 years later, our current president, Donald Trump, also won the presidency, despite losing to Senator and former First Lady Hillary Clinton by an astonishing 3 million votes. suggesting that the electoral college process of electing our nation's leaders doesn't appear to be particularly in tune with the will of the people. Okay, aside from these two father-son teams and the mess they each made of the electoral process, are any other presidents related to each other? Absolutely. The ninth president, William Henry Harrison, who died just a month into his term, giving him the shortest presidency in history, was the grandfather of the 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison. And finally, the nation's 26th president, Theodore Roosevelt, was fifth cousin to the country's 32nd president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who turned out to be the nation's longest-serving president. Want to know something even more extraordinary? It turns out that Franklin Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, was Theodore Roosevelt's niece, and also Franklin's fifth cousin once removed, thereby keeping it all in the family, and making it unnecessary for Eleanor to change her last name when marrying Franklin, the only first lady, be able to make such a claim. Aside from such relational coincidences, what other bizarre coincidences are afoot? How about this one? In 1863, Abraham Lincoln's only surviving child, Robert Todd Lincoln, was standing at the edge of a train platform in New Jersey when the jostling crowds accidentally pushed him onto the tracks just as the train was entering the station. Just seconds away from being crushed by the oncoming locomotive, a bystander reached down and helped Robert back onto the tracks, likely saving his life. That man? Edwin Booth, a local actor of some renown, who just happened to be the brother of John Wilkes Booth, the man who was to assassinate Robert's father just 2 years later. In effect, the son of a president was saved by the brother of the man who would one day kill his father. How's that for serendipity? Unfortunately, that wasn't the only coincidence that was to haunt Robert Lincoln. While he wasn't present when his father was shot at Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865, he was in the city at the time and even visited his father while he lay dying at the Peterson boarding house the next morning. However, he was present when the nation's 20th president, James Garfield, was shot at a Washington train station on July 2, 1881. In fact, he was walking towards Garfield at the time and was just 20 feet away when Garfield was shot, making him an eyewitness to the entire event. Finally, he was on a train that arrived in Buffalo, New York on September 6, 1901, just minutes after the nation's 25th president, William McKinley, was shot while greeting guests at the Pan American Exposition in that same city. While he was not personally present when McKinley was shot, it's curious that he was either nearby or an actual witness to 3 presidential assassinations. I'd imagine future presidents were not keen about having Abe's oldest boy around after that. Speaking of assassinations, another interesting coincidence is known as the Curse of Tippecanoe. According to the story, which is generally considered today as being something of an urban legend, back in 1811, the Shawnee Native American leader Tenskwatawa, the brother of the better-known Shawnee leader Tecumseh, supposedly placed a curse upon the Great White Fathers after their defeat at the hands of a military expedition led by future President William Henry Harrison at the Battle of Tippecanoe. The curse mandated that every president elected in a year ending in 0 would die in office, starting with old Tippecanoe himself. This was Harrison's nickname that he acquired after winning the battle. It stayed with him the rest of his life. True to the curse, in 1840, newly elected President Harrison did indeed die in office just a month after taking oath, most likely from pneumonia. But that wasn't the end of the curse. Lincoln, elected in 1860, Garfield, elected in 1880, McKinley, re-elected in 1900, all succumbed to assassins' bullets, while Warren G. Harding, elected in 1920, and Franklin Roosevelt, re-elected to a third term in 1940, both died of natural causes while in office. Finally, John F. Kennedy, elected in 1960, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, just 3 years later, keeping the legend alive. It almost proved to strike again in 1981, when newly elected President Ronald Reagan, winner of the 1980 election, was shot by an assassin just 2 months into his term. However, he recovered from the attempt, and since no similar tragedies befell either George W. Bush, elected in 2000, or Joe Biden, elected in 2020, many believe that with Reagan and his subsequent survival, the curse was broken. Of course, skeptics maintain that all this is just a bunch of hokum, and one disproven by the fact that no president elected in a year ending in zero after 1960 has died in office, though, as I just stated, there are those who maintain that the curse was broken when Reagan survived John Hinckley's bullet. So what do you think? Was there a curse? I don't know, but it's curious that of the 8 U.S. presidents who've died in office, 7 of them were elected or re-elected in years ending in a zero. Of course, there have been assassination attempts made against other presidents over the years, and several presidents have experienced serious health issues while in office, most of whom were elected in years not ending in a zero, so who can say? Still, it's fun to speculate. So do you know of any other presidential coincidences I have not mentioned here? If so, let me know in the comments. If I get enough of them, maybe I'll make a follow-up video. So if you like this video, I'd appreciate it if you could hit that like button and consider subscribing to see more stories like this from our curious world. It's the only way to grow this channel, so your help is not only important, but is greatly appreciated. So here's your final thought of the day. As Abraham Lincoln was quoted as saying, "The ballot is stronger than the bullet." Of course, that's unless you're watching a play at Ford's Theater. Bye for now. I'll see you next time.